The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the University of Louisiana Systems Budget Briefing webinar. My name is Jackie Tisdale. I'm the Communications Director, and I will be moderating today's webinar. For those who have not joined our webinars before, very quickly, these are 30 minutes in length, including the presentation and question and answer session. You have to submit a question and answer through the question chat module. Those are submitted only to me. They're not seen by all attendees, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll address your questions as much as time will allow to our panelists. All of the microphones are muted except for our speakers. And this webinar is being recorded and will be archived at ulsystem.edu/webinar, as well as the presentation slides. Today's focus is on legislative session, which begins Monday. Specifically, we're going to be breaking down the proposed budget cuts by campus and reviewing those. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll. You should see on your screen the poll question is, the proposed state general fund budget gap for your university is between 1% to 25%, 25% to 50%, 50% to 75%, or 75% to 90%. Now, while you're making your selections on that poll, I want to go ahead and just inform you that today's focus is on budget cuts by campus. Next Friday's focus will be a review of the bills that were filed for session that impact higher education. And then after next week, our weekly webinars are going to be really more of a quick interactive briefing. They aren't going to be focused informational presentations. It's going to be an opportunity for us to update you what's happened within the last week and for you to ask questions. So it'll be a little bit more interactive, maybe shorter. We'll be a little flexible on that. So I'm going to give just a couple more seconds for the poll, then we'll close it. Okay, poll is closing. I'll share the results. 34%, majority of you, believe that the budget cuts for your universities range between 75% to 90%. Followed by 31% believe it's between 25 and 50%. 26% of you believe it's between 50 and 75%, and 9% believe it's between 1% and 25%. And that, of course, will be answered in today's presentation. So at this time, I want to introduce briefly our budget panelists. Dr. Sandra Woodley, our president at the University of Louisiana System, is going to be heading up today's conversation. She's also joined by Rachel Kincaid, our Vice President for External Affairs, and Dr. Edwin Lidoff, our Vice President of Business Affairs. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to UL System President, Dr. Sandra Woodley.
Hello, and thank you again for joining us for the webinar. I wanted to start out today to talk a little bit about why we are so concerned. There are many reasons why we're so concerned about the $608 million gap, but one of the main reasons that we're so concerned is the value that our universities give back to the state. So on the first slide, I mean, this study is actually several years old, and just a note of clarification, the University of New Orleans is not included in this study because they were not part of our system at the time that we did the study in 2009. The other thing to note is in 2009 when we did the study, we had a lot more state funding to look at. At this point, though, when you look back at 2009, we see that our collective colleges and universities economic impact to the state was $8 for every $1 that the state of Louisiana invested in the UL system. And so I think it's really telling to show this $3.4 billion annual impact, and it's broken out by the various categories. And you can see that there were, almost 35,000 non-university jobs even created as a result of the spending in the University of Louisiana system. And I think it's really important to focus the conversation not necessarily on the cuts, although we badly need to find a way to get the cuts back, but why we're worth the money, why it is that our colleges and universities are worth the investment for us to be able to give back to the state. And if you look at the next slide, and this is a little bit, we've added a little bit to this. You've seen some of this in the earlier budget discussions that we've had. But I think it bears repeating. As you look at the 61% increase in tuition and fees over the last years, and then you look at a decrease of 55% in the state funding, the total change in funding to our universities is still $90 million. And it really feels like more than $90 million because we have about $40 million in mandated costs that the institutions have to pay out. So in other words, their discretionary income, the income that they can use to plow back into the classroom, is $90 million plus the fact that they've got to spend more money on mandated costs that will go back into the classroom. So our tuition and fee increases, as I said before, have gone up by 80%. That means our students are paying $3,000 more than they were in 2009. The other point that we've added here that shows the efficiencies of our system is that over this period of time, the cost per degree for our institutions has decreased by almost $10,000. Let me explain a little bit about how we calculate the cost per degree. There's a study called the Delta Cost Study. It's a national study of financial aid, finance people from all over the U.S. that said, let me look at all of the expenses in higher education and come up with a methodology to understand all of that revenue and how much went into educating students, and then use that as a way to look at and to monitor the efficiency of what it costs to produce a degree over time. When we look at 2008 and 2009, overall our system, it cost about $70,000 on average to produce our degrees. And in the latest calculation, that's $59,000. So we, as I said before, we have become $10,000 per degree more efficient over this period of time. The next slide shows what we've done and what some of those efficiencies are. We have 17% fewer employees than we did in 2009. 508 fewer faculty, that's 11%. 360 fewer administrators, that's 34%. And I think it's important to note that the highest percentage increase is in our administrative levels. And a lot of people talk about cutting back on administration, and I think what people don't understand is part of administration includes really important positions to student success, like financial aid helpers and mentors and advisors, wraparound services for student support that goes into helping students to succeed and to go on and graduate sooner. So it may sound like a good thing to have decreases in administrative costs, but some of those administrative costs, particularly that we have had to cut, will eventually affect our ability to get students graduated as early as possible. We've eliminated over 300 academic programs. We've increased online course offerings and degrees. We've had an increase in collaborative degrees, and we've also initiated several sustainability and green initiatives. So I think it's really important to look at some of these things that the universities have done to become more efficient. We have incentivized retirements. We have 95 employees at 5 universities, for example, that took advantage of incentivized retirement, and this yielded, for example, $5 million in savings. There were 36 at McNeese, 12 at Northwestern, 14 at Southeastern, 12 at ULM, and 21 at UNO. Some of our institutions have had to implement over this period of time furloughs. These furloughs impacted about 1,200 employees that generated, around $1.5 million in savings. On the sustainability side, some of our institutions moved to a 4 or 4.5 day work week to capture energy savings. Southeastern also, for example, has been recycling. There's $17,000 in savings there in 2014. Lawn equipment, recycled cafeteria oil, solar panels on power majority of biology buildings. So a lot has been done in the University of Louisiana system to operate more efficiently. I think we are at a point, and maybe have been for some time, that any additional efficiencies will just mean lower quality and our inability to be able to educate the students that we do want to educate in the pipeline. So efficiencies only take you so far, and I think we're past the point, and that's one of the reasons why we're working so desperately to find a solution with the legislature that provides us a situation where there are no additional cuts to the institutions. The next slide, I think, is important to see how our performance has fared over time as well. And when we look at things like graduation rates and retention rates, we know that that can be an imperfect way to look at our performance because we have different kinds of student bodies and different program mix, a different ability in our students to graduate and retain within a certain time period. What we've done to look at that a little more accurately is to compare our performance to peer institutions. What we've done is we've taken a very sophisticated statistical approach, and we've run a model that look at criteria such as the characteristics of the student body, for example, full-time versus part-time, ACT scores, and so on and so forth. The attributes of the faculty, the research intensiveness, for example, of the institutions. And we've said if we want to compare the performance of our institutions, we want to compare their performance to institutions who are like them so that we can have a fair comparison of their performance. So each one of our institutions has their own set of statistical peers, and we're going to talk a little bit about how the funding compares and the performance compares using those statistical peers. Overall, if you look at this slide, you can see that our retention and our graduation rate is almost exactly the same as the collective group of peers. But the other side of the slide, the right side, I think, is the more telling statistic, and that is the case that we have achieved this level of performance parity with our peers at a lot less funding. So our schools have, on average, about $8,800 per student, and this includes tuition and fees and state appropriations, compared with the peers of $12,300. So we're outperforming our resources by a pretty wide margin all across the board. Next slide. This is just a reminder of the problem that we're trying to solve. As you can see, and you've heard many times throughout many hearings and also in the papers, we believe we have a $608 million problem. If we receive $608 million added to the governor's proposed budget, then we will be exactly where we are this year. It will not give us an increase in funding, but it will not decrease our funding. If we were to able to receive $608 million, for example, we would have the same base budgets that we have this year. We would be able to, like we did last year, keep any revenue from tuition increases and plow that back into the classroom. We would be able to use our share of the $40 million WISE fund to be able to proceed with our plans to ramp up our degree production in those high demand fields. So that's the goal. The goal is to fill the entire budget gap with the $608 million. Now I think it's important to break this down by institution. So you can see for each one of the institutions where they stand in funding and performance. The first institution is the University of New Orleans. When we look at their budget, you can see for them, they've had over a $22 million change in total funding. They've lost $22 million over this period since 2009. They've increased their tuition and fees by 38%. Their state funding has dropped by 56%. And as we've talked about many times on our webinars, you can see that they're now 68% reliant on student tuition and fees, whereas in 2009 it was 41%. And to illustrate that, you can see the price increase. The tuition and fee increases have gone up over $3,000. That's 75% for students at UNO over this period of time. Now, during this time, the University of New Orleans has dropped by almost 700 employees. They've lost 32% of their employees in trying to respond to the budget reduction. But if we look at the performance, you can see here when you look at UNO compared to their peers, their retention rate is a little bit lower than their peers. Their graduation rate is a little bit lower than their peers. And of course, their funding is quite a bit lower than their peers. So UNO's funding per FTE is around 12,000 students, $12,000, whereas the peer average is around 14,000. Now, if you look at the next slide, this shows for UNO what their budget gap would be if the entire $608 million was cut. UNO would lose almost $24 million. And again, this is without the executive budget contingency on tax rebates that would have to pass the legislature. But if that did not occur, then they would lose about $24 million. Now let's take a look at Nichols. The reason why we started with UNO is since they came to our system after the economic impact study, we didn't have an economic impact study for them. But for the remaining institutions, we want to take a few minutes and look at their specific page on the economic impact study and then go through their situation. So the next institution is Nichols. For every $1 that Louisiana invested in Nichols in 2009, there was an $8 return. You can see that $274 million annual impact. The next slide shows the same budget history that we talked about with UNO. They're up in tuition and fees by 63%. They're down in state funding by 55%. Their total change in funding has been almost $5 million. And the story is the same there. Their reliance on tuition and fees is now 71% of their operating revenue, whereas it was 40% in 2009. Now, Nichols has lost over 94 employees. They're 11% down in the employees that they have. Now, if we look at Nichols' performance, they're actually performing above their peers, both on retention rates and graduation rates. And as you can see, they're outperforming their resources by a wide margin. Nichols has about $8,000 per student to put into the classroom to achieve this performance, and their statistical peers have almost $11,000. Now, what's the budget gap for Nichols? They stand to lose another $12 million if this 82% cut does occur. Since 2009, they've lost $20 million. That's 58%. Now let's look at McNeese. McNeese also has an $8 return for every $1 that was invested in McNeese in 2009. 2009, it showed a $335 million annual impact to the area for the value that was placed in McNeese. They produced over 3,500 non-university jobs as a result of their spending. Now, if we look at their budget history, we can see a very similar story. 60% increase in tuition and fees, 58% decrease in state funding, for a total change in funding of a little bit less than $10 million. Their tuition and fees have increased about $3,000 or 85% over this time. And like their sister institutions, they're 70% reliant on tuition and fees compared to less than 40% in 2009. McNeese has lost about 183 employees. That's a 15% loss in the employees over this period of time. When we look at their performance relative to their statistical peers, they're on average a little bit above on retention, and they're pretty significantly above on graduation rates. And you can see how their funding compares. The peers at McNeese receive a little more than $11 million per student in funding, and McNeese receives only $7 million. I mean $7,000. Yeah, those millions and thousands. $7,000 compared to $11,000 per FTE. So McNeese is certainly outperforming its resources relative to its statistical peers. And their budget gap for McNeese is $14 million if the governor's budget goes through without the contingencies. $4 million, that's an 82% cut. Since 2008, they've lost $26 million. That would be 60% of their budget. And now let's look at Northwestern. $8 for every $1 invested in Northwestern, a 353 annual impact. they would provide over 3,700 non-university jobs created as a result of Northwestern spending. Huge value for all of our institutions. When you look at their budget history page, you can see a very similar story. They're up 66% in tuition and fees. They're down 56% in state funding for a total change in funding of $8 million, a little more than $8 million. Their tuition and fees have increased over $3,000 for almost 90% increase in tuition and fees over this period of time. And like the other institutions, they're 70% funded by student fees at this point compared to a little less than 40% just in 2009. Northwestern has lost 273 employees over this period of time. That's a 23% decrease in the number of employees at Northwestern. When you look at Northwestern's performance, they're about average, a little bit less than average on retention and graduation rates. But again, they only have $8,500 per student compared to the statistical peers that have almost $12,000 per student. So again, they're certainly outperforming their resources. The budget gap at Northwestern at 82% cut is over $16 million. So if the contingency on tax rebates do not happen, they would stand to lose $16 million more out of their budget. Since 2009, they've lost $28 million. That's 58%. Now let's look at ULM. ULM's economic impact is $350 million. They stand to create jobs as a result of their spending in excess of $3,600 every single year. Again, it's an $8 return for every $1 that Louisiana invested in ULM. And as I said before, this was back in 2009. Because so many fewer dollars from the state are invested in our institutions, the return on that investment is going to be quite a bit larger if we were to do the study again today. If you look at ULM's budget history, you can see 57% increase in tuition and fees, a 54% decrease in state appropriation. So their change in funding is around $13 million down. Their increase in the price for tuition and fees is up around $3,000. That's an 84% increase in their tuition and fees. They are 65% reliant on tuition and fees compared to 35% just in 2009. ULM has lost over 300 employees, or 22% over that period of time. When you look at the performance at ULM compared to their peers, they are a little bit below average on tuition and graduation rates, but quite a bit below average on the funding. ULM has about $8,200 per student compared to a little less than $12,000 per student from the peers. And we've also adjusted the FTE for the pharmacy program. The pharmacy program is a high-cost program, and the peers do not have these medical high-cost programs. So we've used some calculations to net out the pharmacy program so that we can have a more accurate comparison for them, and that's a methodology that we're kind of working on. So if we look at the budget gap for them, it's about $20 million that ULM would stand to lose in the 83% budget cut. Since 2009, they've lost $31 million, or 56%. Now let's take a look at Grambling. Grambling's economic impact in 2009 was $264 million. They stand to create jobs as a result of their spending in excess of 2,700 non-university jobs. And again, like the other ones, they have an $8 return for every $1 that the Louisiana invested in Grambling, and that was in 2009. If you look at their budget history, they've increased tuition and fees by 34%, and they've lost 53% in state funding. Their total change in funding is around $7.8 million. They've increased their tuition and fees by $2,700, about a 72% increase. Their reliance on tuition and fees is now 70%, up from 45% on the students. Grambling has lost 27% of their employees, or around 230 employees. When you look at Grambling's performance relative to their peers, which include mostly other HBCUs, shows that their retention rate is actually a little bit above their peers. Their graduation rate is relatively close to average. But it's a really stark difference in the funding per FTE that Grambling has. Grambling is maintaining this level of performance relative to their peers at about half the money. Grambling only has $7,500 per student to spend to get that performance, but their peers, even the other fellow HBCU peers, have about a little more than $14,000 per student. So Grambling is certainly outperforming their peers when you look at their performance relative to the peers. Grambling's overall budget cut is around $11.2 million should the $83 million budget cuts in the governor's budget occur. And since 2009, they've lost more than $17 million. It's a 56% cut. And now let's turn to Louisiana Tech. Louisiana Tech has a $462 million annual impact on their economy when the study was done in 2009. You can see there that close to 5,000 non-university jobs were created as a result of their spending. If you look at the budget history for Louisiana Tech, they're down a little bit less than $1 million in total funding. Their tuition and fees have increased by almost 80%. Their state funding has decreased by 53%. Their tuition and fees have increased by $3,000, almost 60% increase in tuition and fees over this time. Louisiana Tech now has a 71% reliance on student fees, whereas before they were at about 40%. They've lost 21% of their employees, or about 380 employees. If you look at Louisiana Tech's performance, they are performing higher than their peers on retention and higher than their peers on graduation rate. They have $10,000 per student compared to almost $13,000 for the peers in the average. So like the others, Louisiana Tech is outperforming its money. If you look at the budget cut on tap for Louisiana Tech, should a remedy not be found, an 83% budget cut for them would mean another $22 million to their budget. Since 2008, they've lost 56%, or about $34 million. And next, let's look at Southeastern. Southeastern's economic impact is $564 million. You can see how that's broken out in the graph. Almost 6,000 non-university jobs were created as a result of their spending. Like the others, it's $8 for every $1 that was invested in Louisiana and Southeastern in 2009. It would certainly be higher today if we did it. If you look at the budget history for Southeastern Louisiana, you can see that they've increased tuition and fees by 70%, the revenue. State funding has decreased by 60%. Their change in total funding is a little bit less than $14 million over this period of time. Now, when you look at tuition and fee increases, about $2,800 has been the increase, or 76% in the price to their students. Like the others, they're certainly more reliant on tuition and fees as a source of funds. They're at 72% reliant on student fees, compared to 38% in 2009. Southeastern has lost 13% of their employees, or about 245 employees. When you look at Southeastern's performance relative to their funding, you can see that their retention is basically on parity with their statistical peers. The graduation rate is above their peers. And like the other ones, they are outperforming their resources. You can see that their dollars per FTE available to spend is around $7,500, but the peer institutions have more than $10,000 per student that go back into the classroom. Southeastern's budget gap, should a remedy not be found, would be more than $24 million. Since 2009, they've lost $48 million, or 62%. Next, let's take a look at University of Louisiana Lafayette. Their economic impact to the state is $755 million annual impact based on a study that was done in 2009. They produced a little bit less than 8,000 non-university jobs that were created as a result of their spending. When you look at Lafayette's budget history, you can see that they have an increase in tuition and fee revenue of 76%. They've lost state funding in the percentage of 50%. Total loss of state funding is around $8,800,000. So $8.8 million total change in funding loss to UL Lafayette. During that period of time, they've had a 92% increase in tuition and fees, or $3,298 for each student. Their reliance on tuition and fees right now is 65%, whereas before tuition only made up about 35% of their funding. They've lost about 53 employees during this period of time. When you look at the performance of UL Lafayette, they are better on retention and about average on graduation rate, again, for a lot less money per student. You can see that UL Lafayette has a little bit less than $9,000 per student, and their peers have almost $14,000 per student to get that same performance. So if you look at the particular cut to ULM, UL Lafayette that would happen should a remedy not be found, then we received an 84% budget cut, that would mean almost $37 million cut to ULL. So since 2009, Lafayette's received almost a $50 million cut at about a 52%. So I went through those really quickly, but I thought it would be important for you to see how these numbers compare when you look at each one of our institutions. And as you can see, the budget cuts would be very difficult for these institutions to shoulder on the back of all of the efficiencies that we've talked about before. The cuts that have already been made in the programs and the loss of faculty and administrators that are badly needed for us to be able to increase the number of graduates that we have in our campuses. As we talked about last time, the really important point here is that we need to double the numbers of people who are in our colleges. We need to reach more students. We need to increase our graduates. And we badly need to find $608 million so that we cannot lose our traction and to continue our performance. Even though when you look at our performance relative to the funds now, we're holding our own, and in some cases we're above our performance, there is a law of diminishing marginal returns that is definitely starting to kick in. We will not be able to keep our graduation rates and retention rates where they are now if additional cuts are received. You'll start to see a slip in those rates. It'll take longer for students to be able to graduate. Classes and courses will have to be cut. Sections will have to be cut. Some programs will have to be eliminated. So students who are in the pipeline will have a more difficult time finding what they need to navigate through. And the wraparound services will, also continue to decline. So we're very optimistic that our friends in the legislature are going to help us fill this hole. I think they do know how important it is and what we need to do to be able to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a situation where any of these budget gaps that we talked about today per institution actually does happen. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about, some of the other economic impacts that have accrued to the system based on UL. When you look at quality of life, on average, there are more than 100 events taking place every single day on the UL campuses. The immersion of each one of our campuses in their community life and in their region is really an important part of what a university does, that regional impact that each university has in their community. These things are very important. These are going on, and I think it really adds to the value of the institution. The other point I would like to make is the research and the service that happens at the institutions. We have a lot of research centers and service programs, created or sustained jobs, 26,000, generated or saved business revenue, $3 billion, simulated investment dollars, $132 million. We provided $108 million in direct cost savings for services. And then, of course, there's the teaching side, making sure that we can increase the educational attainment of the people in Louisiana. A lot of information, I know, to go through in a short period of time. I think the takeaways from today allow us to understand the huge value that our universities have, not only to the state, but also to their local communities and to the students that we serve, to the economy of Louisiana. And we're definitely focused on trying to find a way to fill that $608 million gap so that we can continue our progress. And Jackie, with that, I think we can take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Woodley. My goodness, that was a lot of information to try to compress in a short amount of time. We are running a little bit over, so I'm just going to ask one question, and if you submitted a question that we can't get to today, we'll try to follow up with you with those answers. So my question, and this is to any of the three of you, what upcoming opportunities are there to advocate for higher education funding?
Yes, actually this week on Wednesday, the House Appropriations Committee will begin taking public testimony. It is at the conclusion of the Joint Legislative Committee on the Budget, so sometimes those meetings run longer, so it's actually going to be, it probably could be anywhere between 10 and 10:30 or 11. It's in room 5 at the Capitol, and this will be the opportunity for the public to talk about the impact of the higher education funding cuts and what that will mean to every student, faculty, staff, and community member. So that's this Wednesday, and we will certainly post that on our site as well.
Okay, thank you. And that's all the time we have today. I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar. Our next one will be next Friday. Again, that will be an opportunity for us to go over all of the legislation that's been filed and how that will impact higher education. And after next week's webinar, the weekly webinars will start being more of an interactive update and question and answer session. So thanks everybody for attending, and this will be posted along with the presentation and all the slides on the UL Systems website. Have a great weekend.